Saul wanted David dead. The king of Israel, consumed by hatred and envy, did not hesitate to use all his power to destroy the life of a young man who had never done anything other than be loyal to him. But what began as a personal vendetta almost destroyed the entire people of Israel. Have you ever felt chased by something you don't deserve, feeling like your whole world is falling apart around you? The feeling of being targeted by a relentless enemy can be devastating. However, as we saw in the story of David, even in the darkest moments, there is hope. There is a way to survive, win, and still achieve a destiny much greater than what the enemy planned. Let's find out how he did it. Before we go to the video, just check if you are already subscribed here to the channel, because on this channel, I will bring a series of content like this, which will be a life lesson. It was an ordinary morning in Israel, but for young David, what would happen there would change his life forever. He was still a sheep herder, without any idea of what fate had in store for him. However, in an epic battle, where the fate of the people of Israel was at stake, a man named David was catapulted into history. He faced the giant Goliath, who terrorized the forces of Israel and defeated him with a simple sling and a stone. This seemingly simple victory made everyone's eyes turn to him and placed him on a pedestal that no one would have imagined. But while the people cheered and exalted David's name, something else was brewing in the shadows. King Saul, the leader of Israel at the time, observed everything with different eyes. He knew the people loved him, but David's victory was more than he could handle. He was not just a young hero, but a silent threat. And the more people sang of David's victory, the more Saul felt like his throne was being pulled away from him. Just imagine, you are on top of a mountain, you have achieved everything you have, but suddenly someone appears and with a simple gesture receives all the adulation of the people. How would you react? That's Saul's feeling. He who was already king found himself threatened by the brilliance of David, who seemed to be the person everyone adored. And here, the hate begins. Not just any hatred, but a hatred fueled by insecurity and the fear of losing something you spent your entire life trying to protect. And what is more dangerous than someone who, instead of facing a threat head-on, begins to act in the shadows, manipulating situations, creating intrigue. This hatred, disguised as contempt, grew within Saul like a silent disease. And as the people sang, Saul slew his thousands, but David his 10,000s, something in the king's heart broke. Can you feel the weight of this moment? Saul, who was once loved, now found himself small compared to the man the people were acclaiming. He could no longer ignore the fact that in terms of popularity, David far surpassed him. And worse, he knew that somewhere, Israel's future was no longer in his hands. The words of greeting, the music and the dance in honor of David only increased his anguish. Instead of seeing a hero, Saul began to see a rival. On the one hand, he saw himself as God's chosen king, but on the other, he felt that his reign was about to be challenged. It's not hard to understand why this consumed him. Many times in our lives, something that seemed to be a legitimate achievement begins to be threatened. And deep down, we all have this feeling that if someone else takes my place, what will be left for me? It is a universal dilemma, not only for kings, but for anyone who is afraid of losing what they have achieved. And so, with Saul's spirit weakening every day, he began to take unthinkable actions. He no longer saw David as an ally or even as someone worthy of being his successor. Instead, he saw in him a threat that needed to be eliminated, and it is at this point that Saul's hatred begins to take shape. Each of David's victories, each acclamation of his name, transformed the king into a man full of doubts, anger, and finally envy. What many don't know is that this feeling of envy was not just a passing emotion. It became a force that controlled Saul and shaped his actions. He could no longer see David as one of his people, but rather as someone who had become the very threat to his throne. As a result, what was once a simple disagreement now became something much more dangerous. Imagine what it's like to look around and see that someone you once trusted, someone who seemed to be on your team, is now seen by everyone as superior, as the true leader of Israel. Insecurity turns into fear, and fear turns into hate. And it is exactly this hatred that began to form in the depths of Saul's heart, while David, without knowing it, was about to face something much bigger than he imagined. But what no one knew was that while Saul planned his secret actions, David continued to live his life as simply as possible. He, the young shepherd, never thought that one day he would have to deal with a king willing to do anything to destroy him. After all, he just wanted to help his people, like he always did. And yet, what he didn't know was that his life was about to turn into a battlefield where not only his loyalty but also his survival would be tested in ways he never imagined. After once the spark of hatred was lit in Saul's heart, nothing could extinguish it. The king, consumed by envy that was not only personal but also political, began to make decisions that put not only his own sanity at risk, but the peace of the entire kingdom of Israel. With each victory of David, with each acclamation of the people, Saul's heart hardened more and more. What was once a young hero, someone worthy of admiration, now became a target to be eliminated. Saul's problem was not just his growing anger, but the fact that he was willing to sacrifice everything to ensure that what he saw as his legitimacy on the throne was not threatened. His own security, his kingdom, his own inner peace were subordinated to the desire to destroy David, which placed the nation of Israel on the brink of chaos. Instead of being the king who united, Saul was becoming the one who divided, and the motivation for this division was a feeling, perhaps the most dangerous of all, envy. What he didn't understand, however, was that his actions against David would only increase the people's love for him. Then Saul made a decision that would change their fate forever. He began sending David into battle, hoping that the young warrior would be killed. This was a calculated move, an attempt to get rid of David without having to get his own hands dirty. Saul was confident that by sending David to fight the Philistines, he would not return. It was a cunning strategy, but also extremely risky. After all, David was not just any soldier. He had already defeated Goliath, and his courage and skill on the battlefield were unmatched. Saul didn't know it, but instead of being destroyed, each battle David faced made him stronger and more respected. Not only did David return victorious, but he returned with the trust and love of the people, which, instead of weakening the king, only further strengthened what appeared to be an enemy within his own ranks. He was creating a kind of national hero, a person who the people were beginning to see as more worthy of ruling than the king himself. David's victories, instead of weakening his power, ended up undermining the foundations of Saul's own reign. It was like a downward spiral for Saul. Each attempt to eliminate him only made David grow, and this intensified Saul's hatred even more. It was no longer a question of David being just a successful warrior or a folk hero. To Saul, he was an existential threat, someone who represented the loss of everything he believed he possessed. The throne, the worship of the people, power itself. All of this was at stake, and the king could no longer tolerate this threat. He knew that if David continued to grow in power and influence, his own reign would hang in the balance. At the same time that Saul sent David to war, he also used other, more personal methods to try to destroy the young hero. He began to pursue him relentlessly. He knew he couldn't just send David to his death without it looking like a direct assassination attempt. So he resorted to manipulation. Saul used his own environment of trust to set a trap. He offered his daughter Michal to David as a way to further entangle him in palace politics, thinking that over time David would become more vulnerable. He increasingly tried to entangle David in the political game, in the plot of the royal court, but without knowing it, he was creating more reasons for David to be seen as the true leader of Israel. Saul's every step, instead of weakening David, only brought him closer to his destiny. Saul thought he was manipulating the game, that he was being clever, but what he didn't realize was that his obsession with David was just making it clearer to the people who was truly worthy of being the next king. Throughout this time, Saul's insecurity was reflected in his actions, his words, and his acts of persecution. It was no longer about governing, it was about destroying someone who, in Saul's mind, represented everything he feared, a rival who was not only more loved by the people, but who was beginning to challenge the established order. Saul began to lose control. His attempts to eliminate David were no longer as cunning as he imagined. With each ambush, David escaped, stronger, more determined and, curiously, more loved by the people. Every time Saul sent David to war with the hope of seeing him fall, David returned victorious, and the victory not only made David stronger, but left Saul even weaker, even more desperate. Saul's war was not just against David, but against everything he had built: his own confidence, his own peace, and most importantly, the love of the people he was beginning to lose. What Saul didn't know was that the people were beginning to see in David not just a victorious warrior, but the future king of Israel. At this point in the story, a very important question arises. What causes someone, in his insatiable quest for power, to lose himself to the point of pursuing the only man who could help save his nation? What leads someone to make such irrational decisions, putting not only their life, but the lives of everyone around them at risk? Saul's insecurity became his greatest weakness, and this, in the end, was what led to his downfall. And you, what do you think of this Saul situation? Have you ever experienced moments where the fear of losing something made you act in ways you never imagined? Leave your opinion in the comments and share your experience. The insecurity of Saul had already become a constant shadow in his life, and the anger he felt towards David, increasingly evident, no longer found space to be contained. Everything that was once an uncomfortable tension became an obsession with destruction. Saul was, at a point of no return, unable to control how he felt. Hatred for David was no longer something controlled, but a flame that burned incessantly in his heart, dominating his thoughts, actions, and decisions. It was in one of these rages, where he could no longer distinguish between reason and emotion, that Saul took a drastic action, an action that would show everyone how far he was willing to go to eliminate David. The setting was in the palace, in the very place where the king should feel safest and where, theoretically, it should be the basis of his nation's peace. Saul was there, sitting on his throne, and David, who was already part of his court, was playing his harp, as he did to ease Saul's spirit in times of distress. But at that moment, the music did not bring calm or tranquility. She seems to have further accentuated the open wound in the king's heart. Can you imagine this? David, with his harp, playing softly to appease the king, trying to bring harmony to the environment. He was a simple young man who was there to serve, to help, to be Israel's hero. But for Saul, every chord played, every musical note was like a blade that cut deeper. David's music no longer calmed his anger. On the contrary, it fueled the desire for revenge even more. Saul was consumed. His heart was beating fast. His blood ran hot through his veins, and in the midst of that stillness, something exploded inside him. Without further warning, without any sign of hesitation, he picked up a spear and threw it at David. It was a direct attack, a thoughtless movement, but filled with deep hatred. Saul wanted, once and for all, to destroy that young man who, in his eyes, was the cause of all his fears, all his insecurity, his loss of power. What happened in that moment was more than a simple act of violence. It was the exposure of a mind disturbed by a destructive feeling. David, by instinct, reacted quickly. As the spear passed through the air, he jumped to the side, dodging the deadly attack, and then at the same moment, a mixture of fear and relief took over his body. He knew his life was hanging in the balance. Saul no longer wanted him as an ally. He no longer saw him as someone who deserved his trust. For the king, David had become something to be exterminated, a threat that could not be ignored. Imagine the scene. David, the people's hero, now on the run from a king who had once embraced him as part of his household. As someone who was treated like a son, he was now being attacked by the very leader of the people he loved. There is nothing more tragic than betrayal from someone you trusted, and that is exactly what happened that day. Saul not only tried to physically kill David, but he also tried to destroy everything David had stood for: trust, loyalty, and hope for a better future for Israel. It was not just an attack on David's life, but on the very spirit of unity that had been cultivated between the king and the people. David, with a speed that surprised even himself, escaped that deadly attack. But his situation, which was already complicated, became even more dangerous. That incident was not a simple outburst of anger by a king, but the beginning of a relentless persecution that would last for months, perhaps even years. When Saul threw the spear at David, he was not just trying to kill him physically, but he was starting a psychological battle, a battle where he would use his authority, his soldiers, and his power to hunt David until there was nothing left. Saul's hatred would become like a heavy cloak that he would carry to every corner of Israel. David, in turn, could not stay there to face Saul face to face. He knew his only chance of survival was to escape, and quickly, in the blink of an eye, he found himself in the field again as a simple fugitive, without the support of any army, without the security of a king at his side. The once acclaimed man who had defeated Goliath now found himself forced to run for his life, to hide in caves and forests, away from Saul's watchful eye. He moved away from the comforts of the palace to take refuge on the margins of a war that seemed to have no end. The most painful thing, perhaps, was the sense of betrayal that David felt. He wasn't just a fugitive, he was a man who had been betrayed by the king himself. The pain of being rejected by someone he once considered a mentor, someone who embraced him like a son, was crushing. It was a silent but deep pain. David was not just running for his life, but running from a bitter disillusionment, one that put him in a position where he didn't know who else he could trust. The king of Israel, the person who was supposed to protect him, now wanted to destroy him. And Saul, for his part, did not give up. The first assassination attempt did not satisfy him. He felt frustrated, furious, and more determined than ever to eradicate David from his life. Saul didn't just want to get rid of a rival. He wanted to destroy the hope that David represented for the people of Israel. With each new day, Saul's pursuit became more relentless, more calculated. He sent his troops to hunt David, to surround him, to find where he was hiding, and each time David escaped, it only fueled Saul's fury. From that point on, David was not just running from Saul, he was literally in a battle for his life. With each step, he found himself more alone, more distant from everything that had once been his home, his safety and his normal life. He became Israel's most wanted fugitive, but at the same time, the hero that the people began to see as the legitimate savior of their nation. Now, can you understand how Saul's hatred knew no bounds? How could he, a king, be willing to destroy everything in his path, even his own nation, just to make sure David didn't take what he felt was rightfully his? Saul's blindness, fueled by envy, made him lose control of the situation. And in the end, It was not just David's life that was at stake, but the future of the entire people of Israel. After the assassination attempt, David was forced to flee for his life. The kingdom of Israel, which until recently seemed to be a place of promise and prosperity, has become the scene of merciless persecution. Saul, increasingly obsessed with eliminating David, spared no effort in hunting him down. He sent soldiers, spread rumors, and did everything he could to find the young man who had once been his friend, but had now become his mortal enemy. But David was not alone in this race for survival. Although he was a man on the run, he found something that many could call fortress, the loyalty of a group of followers, people who believed in him, who trusted his leadership, and who were willing to face any adversity by his side. Imagine the scene. David running for his life, but instead of being alone in the desert, he begins to attract people. They were not experienced warriors or soldiers in Saul's army. They were not powerful or noble men who saw David as an opportunity for status. No, the first to join him were men rejected by society, people who, like David, were in search of something greater, something that went beyond persecution and betrayal. They were despised, indebted, afflicted people, men who, like David, were on the margins of society and in some way saw in him the hope of a new reality. David did not have Saul's throne. He did not have the power of a royal army or the luxury of a palace, but there was something much more valuable in his hands: the trust and respect of those who followed him. What he actually had was people's hearts. These men who followed him were not after material rewards or riches. They did not see him as the next king in a struggle for power, but as a leader worthy of respect, someone who, despite being persecuted and wronged, demonstrated unshakable courage, a firm character, and a vision of the future that spoke directly to the souls of those who accompanied him. Each of these followers of David had a story. Many of them were men in debt, men who had been rejected by society or were running away from personal problems. But when they met David, they realized something in his heart that made them join him. They were tired of being despised, tired of living on the margins, and David, even in his own struggle, represented an opportunity for redemption for them. He did not judge them, but accepted them as they were. David, in his humiliation, found a way to be the light to those who were in their own shadows. With every step David took through the wilderness, into the Rocky Mountains, and into the caves, he was not just fleeing from Saul's pursuit. He was, in some ways, building a new kind of community, a community based on loyalty, trust, and common purpose. It was not a group of people who followed him out of fear or self-interest. They were there because they believed in him. They were willing to face the same persecution, go through the same difficulties, and fight the same battles, because they knew that David was a man who was not just in search of power, but of justice. During the time that David took refuge in the caves and mountains, he had to deal with the dilemmas of being a leader without a throne. He knew that with each passing day, his situation became more difficult. But at the same time, he saw that his followers were becoming stronger, more united. They didn't have riches, but they had something that many others, including Saul, couldn't understand: a sense of purpose, a unity around a man who, although he was a fugitive, was willing to fight for something bigger than himself. These men became David's first faithful followers. They weren't just followers, they were brothers. They came to be known as the mighty men of David, and their exploits in battle became legendary. Each of them, through their actions, became a reflection of David's leadership. They weren't just following a leader, they were becoming one with the leader. When one of the mighty men threw himself into battle alongside David, he was not just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the honor of a man who believed in him, for a better future that David promised, even if that future was still a distant vision. The courage and loyalty of these men formed the nucleus of a resistance that would later prove fundamental to David's ascension to the throne. Furthermore, the difficulties that David faced alongside his followers created an indestructible bond between them. In times of hunger and thirst, in times of exhaustion and fear, David never stopped being the leader who inspired confidence. He did not see them as mere soldiers, but as companions. He shared his pains, his anxieties, and his victories. This relationship of trust and solidarity was what made his leadership unique. David knew that unlike Saul, who ruled with fear and distrust, he ruled with his heart. And that was what his followers saw in him. The loyalty David received from his followers was not a reflection of his military strength or his status as king. She was a reflection of David's character, the way he treated people, how he cared about his men and treated them as equals. There was no arrogance in David. There was no tyranny or abuse of power. He knew that his true strength lay in the support of his people, in the trust and loyalty of those who believed in him. While Saul, the king of Israel, was isolated in his palace, surrounded by an army, but without the respect of the people, David was in the midst of difficulties, in caves, in the mountains, and in the desert, surrounded by men who respected him and followed him by choice, not by obligation. That made all the difference. The loyalty of those men, even without riches, without power, was stronger than any army Saul could muster. And unexpectedly, David was building something that would ultimately be more powerful than any throne or crown. He was building a solid foundation of support, a foundation that would lead him eventually to kingship. Now tell me, have you ever been in a situation where you were abandoned or despised by everyone, but found support from the right people? How has this impacted your life? I want to know your opinion in the comments. Share your experience with us. The tension, it was palpable in the mountains. David, with his few loyal men, walked silently through a rocky and arid terrain, always keeping a watchful eye, as he knew that at any moment they could be surrounded by Saul's troops. The persecution was becoming unsustainable. Saul had intensified the hunt, sparing no resources in trying to find David, and the chances of an ambush increased every day. But that day, something peculiar happened. David and his men had taken refuge in a cave in the desert of En-Gedi, a difficult-to-access place, perfect for hiding and waiting for the right moment to act. The silence was absolute. Only the sound of the wind and stones being dragged by the air currents broke the stillness. It was there, hidden among the shadows, that David experienced one of the most intense trials of his entire escape. Suddenly, the winds of bad luck blow even stronger. Saul, the king of Israel, arrived at the same cave. He was alone, not realizing that David and his men were there, so close, so within reach of his hands. Imagine the scene. Saul enters the cave to rest, relieved by the pressure of the chase, unaware that his pursuer was just meters away from him. He settles down, and without wanting to, the king of Israel finds refuge in the same place where the man he wanted to kill was hiding. For David, the opportunity was clear, as if heaven itself had opened a breach for him. He knew that if he wanted to, he could end all this persecution once and for all. David's men, as expected in a situation like this, began to pressure him, encouraging him to take advantage of the chance. "Look, David, the Lord has delivered your enemy into your hands," they said with almost unshakable certainty. The temptation was strong. Who wouldn't want to put an end to relentless chasing once and for all? Who wouldn't want to pick up their spear, walk to where Saul was, and put an end to this war once and for all? After all, Saul had betrayed David in so many ways. He who was the king of Israel, whom David once served loyally, had now become his greatest enemy. The king tried to kill him mercilessly out of pure envy and fear. Saul's anger seemed endless, but David was not a man driven by revenge or the desire for self-righteousness. He knew that his story would not be marked by killing his enemy, but by how he would treat his enemies. And at that moment, something in his heart told him that this was not God's will. The voice of the Lord, quiet but firm, resounded in his spirit. Now is not the time for you to be the judge, David. David, in a moment of deep reflection, remembered the words that God had spoken to him at another time. God was in control, and Israel's throne was not in his hands, but in God's hands. He knew that kingship over Israel would not be something he would take by force, but would be something that God would give him at the right time. Saul's death was not what God wanted for David. Revenge was not David's role. No matter how difficult it was, David understood that he must trust in divine plans and wait for the right moment. In this moment of tension, with Saul's spear in front of him, David chose the path of integrity. He approached Saul quietly, not with the intention of doing harm, but to demonstrate his own trust in God. With his heart full of respect, David cut off a piece of Saul's cloak, but did not kill him. In doing so, David knew that by lifting this piece of robe before Saul, he was doing something that would speak louder than any words. He was showing that he had the power to kill him, but he was choosing not to. He was telling Saul that even in his persecution, David did not want revenge, but only justice. David then withdrew with his men to a safe place, out of Saul's sight. But soon after, he took a bold step, a step that only someone with a pure heart could take. He climbed onto a hill and in a steady voice shouted to Saul and his soldiers who were still nearby, "Saul, king, look what I have done. I could have killed you, but I didn't. Look at the piece of your cloak. I am not your enemy. I will not pursue you." The scene was, without a doubt, a moment of great tension and meaning. Saul, upon hearing David's voice, looked towards him and saw the piece of the cloak cut off. Something touched Saul's heart at that moment. He looked at David, and his anger subsided, at least for a brief moment. Saul recognized that David had been merciful, that he had been sparing, and this made him reflect. After all, David had the right to take revenge, but he didn't. Instead of an act of violence, David chose patience, trust in God, and dignity. However, Saul's repentance was brief. Even in the face of such an act of mercy, the hardness of his heart was not completely calmed. But David, in that moment, did something that few would have done. He showed that his character was greater than any desire for revenge. David knew that he was not the one who should do justice. He knew that God would do this at the right time. He trusted that by placing his faith in God, everything would be resolved fairly, and that he would receive the throne when the time was right. David's decision not to kill Saul and the way he handled this opportunity for revenge teaches us a powerful lesson. Often we, like David, are tempted to act in our own strength, to take the law into our own hands, to respond to evil with more evil. But as David shows us, it is possible to choose the path of patience and trust that God will do what is right at the right time. Well, we're already reaching the halfway, and I realized that you still have not liked this video. This is very important for YouTube to continue to provide our content to you, so please leave a like on this video, which is free. The heavy air of the mountain was still permeated with the tension of the previous minutes. The echo of David's voice resounded among the rocks, and the men around him anxiously awaited Saul's reaction. After David showed so much mercy and patience, even with the chance to get rid of his greatest enemy, everyone was in suspense. Would Saul understand David's magnanimity? Or was this once again just an empty gesture in the face of the fury of a king tormented by envy and fear? David, with a piece of Saul's cloak in hand, walked up the hill toward his own truth. He wasn't just showing a piece of cloth. He was revealing something much deeper. He was offering Saul the chance to see the goodness of his heart, to understand that despite everything that had happened, he did not want revenge. What David was doing there was not just a gesture of mercy. It was a testimony of his faith in God, that he would not take for himself the justice that belongs only to the Lord. As Saul's soldiers watched from afar, David called out to the king, his voice resounding among the stones, as strong as the confidence he had in his own heart. "Saul, look what I did. I could have ended you, but I chose to spare your life because I am not your enemy," he said with a firm and honest tone. It was more than a statement of not wanting to kill him. It was a statement of character. David was saying that he was not driven by anger or envy like Saul. He didn't need to eliminate Saul to achieve his own goals. He trusted that when the time was right, God would do what was necessary. Saul, who until that moment had seemed blind in his pursuit, stopped. He looked at the piece of robe, and for a brief moment something changed in his heart. The anger and envy that had always consumed him gave way to surprise. What he saw before him was not a man who wanted harm, but someone who possessed what he had never had, a pure heart without resentment, without revenge. He looked at David with a perplexed expression, and his own eyes moistened with emotion. The king of Israel, the man who felt threatened by David, was touched by the young man's act of kindness. For a moment he saw the truth and recognized that David was not like him, but did Saul really understand? He had been blinded by envy for so long. He had been a king who in his pride could not see God's hand in David's life. And yet in that moment, something ignited in his soul. He responded more calmly with words that at first glance might seem like genuine repentance. "You are more righteous than I, because you repaid me with good when I repaid you with evil," said Saul. This sentence, in the midst of his momentary sincerity, reflected a breach in the wall of hatred he had built over the years. He finally understood that David, with his attitude, was living according to a higher principle, a principle that Saul had long since lost. Saul looked into David's eyes, and his voice, which had been threatening and angry, became softer, almost contrite. He then said something that sounded like an acknowledgement, although at that moment his pain and envy did not leave him completely free from his tyranny. "I know that you will certainly be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." It was a partial confession, a statement that brought the truth to light, but was also steeped in a lament for the position Saul had lost. At this moment, David did not let himself be carried away by the euphoria of having achieved something as would be natural for anyone else. He knew that Saul had not yet fully surrendered to God, but he also knew that his kindness had not been in vain. Even though Saul's recognition was not entirely genuine, the fact that Saul saw the truth in David's actions was a reflection of the young man's unique character. It wasn't about being the next king of Israel, but about how he treated his neighbors, especially when he had the power to destroy them. David then, with humility and wisdom, responded to Saul, saying that he did not wish any harm on him, and that one day the Lord would take care of what was just. He reaffirmed that the fight was not against Saul, but against the forces that manipulated him, forces that prevented him from seeing the reality of God's goodness. He knew that revenge was never the way, and Israel's future did not depend on their strength to kill, but on their patience and their trust that the Lord would bring justice in due time. Saul, although touched in that moment, did not seem completely transformed. He who had declared that David would be the next king of Israel returned home, but his heart was not completely at peace. He knew that the future of the kingdom was in David's hands, but he could not free himself from the internal struggle he felt. What David had done not only touched Saul, but also deeply touched everyone who was with him at that moment. Those around David saw how his kindness not only made a difference in his own life, but also in the lives of those around him. In the end, David's gesture was not just proof of his kindness, but a lesson for all of us that true greatness is not in destroying your enemies, but in doing good to them, even when we have the power to destroy them. Like David, we are called to act with integrity and trust that God knows the right time to act. Sometimes we are challenged to do what is most difficult, to forgive, to be patient, even when we are given the power to fight back. This is true strength, the strength that David demonstrated in the cave, and the same strength that silently but immeasurably shaped Israel's destiny. The cave had echoed with words of reconciliation and kindness, but soon after that meeting, the peace that seemed to have emerged between David and Saul collapsed. King Saul, although touched by that gesture of mercy, could not deal with David's presence as a living threat, a threat that he knew would sooner or later take his place. Something deeper was corrupting his soul, something he couldn't control. Insecurity, envy, and fear consumed him every day, and David's words, so full of respect and dignity, were unable to appease the fury in his heart. Back in his palace, Saul seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, trapped within a web of emotions that he could not overcome. Anger, resentment, and frustration built up inside him, and his obsession with destroying David grew with each passing day. He knew that David was growing stronger, more admired by the people, and this made him feel weaker and weaker. He didn't want to admit it, but somewhere in his heart he knew that Israel's future was about to be determined by the young man he had tried to eliminate in so many ways. And that thought didn't just torment him, it drove him crazy. Meanwhile, David, in his patience and wisdom, tried to find a peaceful way out of that situation. He knew the king was lost, but somehow he still harbored hope that peace could be restored. But this hope, however genuine, began to fade as the days passed. Saul could not escape his own bitterness, and his mind was dominated by a single goal: to destroy David. It was as if, with each failed attempt to defeat him, Saul's hatred increased. But the anger was no longer limited to young David. Saul was willing to destroy anything, even the peace he had sworn to protect as king of Israel. That obsession was blinding his reason and his vision of what really mattered. He was no longer thinking about the well-being of his people, but about how he could eliminate his rival at any cost, even if it meant risking the destruction of his own kingdom. The story takes an even darker turn when Saul decides to act more aggressively. He sends men to hunt David relentlessly, determined to bring him to his death, and does so with an increasingly obsessive fervor. But David, with impressive cunning, continues to escape Saul's traps, always ahead, always more attentive to the details that could put his life at risk. But what was most impressive was that, even in the face of so much persecution and betrayal, David never deviated from his purpose. He refused to take what wasn't his. He refused to act like Saul. He never sought revenge, and that made him even stronger. At this point in the story, something very powerful begins to unfold. The conflict between Saul and David begins to expand into something even greater. The fight was no longer just between a king and a man, but between two destinies, two completely different paths for Israel's future. What Saul failed to see was that by trying to destroy David, he was leading the country into imminent civil war. It was as if he was willing to sacrifice everything, even the peace of his people, to satisfy the desire for revenge that consumed him. Saul's desire to kill David became such a powerful obsession that he began to ignore the consequences of his actions. He knew that by relentlessly persecuting David, he was creating a division in the heart of Israel, a division that, if left unaddressed, could completely destroy the country. But Saul's hatred, which now had such deep roots in his heart, blinded him to reality. He no longer saw the consequences of his actions. He was driven by pure rage, a fire that drove him to go further and further without caring about the collateral damage. The situation became so critical that Saul himself was willing to risk everything, even the kingdom of Israel, in the name of his personal revenge. The war he was promoting within his own heart was about to be reflected in his relationship with the people who were beginning to feel the weight of this persecution. The division deepened, and what was once a united kingdom began to fragment. Saul's fury not only threatened David, but also the unity of Israel itself. And so, as David continued to flee, trying to survive, and Saul's men advanced tirelessly to capture him, the tension only increased. The kingdom was on the verge of collapse, and Saul's hatred was becoming more and more evident. Israel, which was already facing external difficulties, now found itself facing a devastating internal conflict caused by its king's obsession. But at the same time, an idea began to form in the hearts of all those who followed David. They were beginning to understand that David was the future of Israel, and that the salvation of the kingdom would not come through Saul's revenge, but through the just and pious leadership of that young man who, instead of using force, used wisdom and trust in God. However, even as the truth began to dawn on many, there was still a fight to be fought, and David knew that his path was far from easy. He did not seek war, but he could not escape the fate that was being prepared for him. And so, with each persecution of Saul, with each attempt at destruction, the story of David and Saul continued to unfold, more and more intense, more dramatic. Now, the question that remains is, how could Saul, with his uncontrollable rage, prevent his own kingdom from falling apart? And would David, with his pure heart, be able to remain faithful to his principles? Or would he be forced to fight against the king himself in the name of the good of the people? What would Israel's future really hold? Leave your opinion in the comments. How do you think this conflict will end? Will Saul's hatred be defeated by David's patience and wisdom, or will there be more betrayals ahead? The heart of Israel was divided. What had once been a united nation now found itself in an intense and increasingly dangerous conflict. On the one hand were those faithful to King Saul, still following his command, guided by a fragile hope that the king could regain control and defeat David. On the other side were the men who had joined David, those who had taken refuge with him in the mountains and caves, believing that David was the true leader of Israel, the man who should occupy Saul's throne. What seemed like a fight between two men, in reality, was a confrontation that threatened the survival of the country itself. It was as if Israel's destiny was hanging by a thread, about to be cut by Saul's wrath and David's loyalty. The situation was critical. Battles became frequent, with David's forces and Saul's forces facing each other directly in different parts of Israel. Each skirmish increased the danger of a civil war that could irreparably devastate the kingdom. The people were tired, divided, and no longer knew who to trust. Chaos seemed to take over the land, and families were divided, many with members fighting on one side or the other. It was a scene of impending tragedy, and the nation of Israel, which had once been strong and prosperous, was now on the verge of shattering into pieces. But in the midst of all this, something different was happening to David. While Saul increasingly gave in to anger and pride, moving away from God and his principles, David remained firm in his faith. He was not a perfect man, far from it, but his trust in God never wavered. While the nation was about to be destroyed because of Saul's hatred, David sought wisdom, prayed for direction, and trusted in the divine plan. He knew that he could not resolve the conflict with his own strength, and that he should not seek revenge, but rather trust that God would direct the course of events. David knew that the civil war, if it continued, would mean the death of many Israelites. He had already witnessed the pain and suffering that Saul's persecution had caused, and he no longer wanted to see the people of Israel torn apart. But as much as he wanted peace, David also knew that Saul's destruction was inevitable. Saul had surpassed all limits of reason and righteousness, and as a result, the kingdom was being corroded by his anger and lack of wisdom. However, David also understood that God's plan for Israel was still in progress and that he must wait for the right moment to take the throne without violating divine principles. The critical moment arrived when the forces of Saul and David met in a decisive battle. However, instead of starting a massacre, David strategically withdrew. He was not there to destroy the nation of Israel, but to protect his people and restore the unity that had been lost. Although he had the opportunity to destroy Saul and end his leadership once and for all, David once again resisted. He knew that killing Saul was not the answer, as this would only further increase the chaos and division between the tribes of Israel. Saul, in turn, did not have the same wisdom. Instead of learning from David's mercies and recognizing that his time had come, he moved toward the final confrontation. His heart, increasingly hardened by pride, was beyond redemption. With each step he moved further away from God, leaving aside the authority that the Lord had once given him. And so the battle between the forces of Saul and David became inevitable. At a crucial moment, Saul and his sons faced the Philistines in one last great battle on Mount Gilboa. The battle was brutal, and Saul, in his desperate attempt to save what was left of his leadership, was seriously wounded. King Saul's death was not a victory for David, but a tragic consequence of his own choice. When news of Saul's death reached David, he did not celebrate. On the contrary, he mourned deeply, as if he were mourning the death of a brother, because deep down, David always respected Saul, despite everything. He knew that at one time Saul had been a great leader, but he had failed by allowing himself to be consumed by pride and anger. Now, with Saul's death, David, with his loyalty to God and the people, could finally assume the throne. But what was seen in the nation of Israel, even after Saul's death, was a broken kingdom. The northern tribes who had followed Saul were not willing to immediately accept David as king. The blood of the conflict was still fresh, and distrust hung in the air. David knew that it was not enough to simply sit on the throne. He needed to unite the tribes and restore peace to Israel. This would be a daunting task, but again he trusted God to guide him every step of the way. In time, the tribes united under David, and he was finally crowned as king of Israel, not on the basis of his military strength, but on the wisdom God had given him and the way he had treated his enemies, always with kindness and justice. The war that nearly destroyed Israel was not only avoided, it was overcome by David's wisdom, patience, and mercy. He became the king God desired, not only because of his courage, but because of his ability to forgive and rule justly. David, then, governed with integrity, always seeking to do what was right in the eyes of God. And although his ascension to the throne was not easy, he ultimately fulfilled God's plan for Israel, leading the people back to prosperity and peace. But, as always, the lessons he learned from life's challenges and from his relationship with Saul have become an eternal example for us all. David's story teaches us that even in times of great adversity and anger, there is always a choice to be made. The choice between hatred and forgiveness, between revenge and mercy. And that was exactly what prevented the destruction of Israel. The kindness and wisdom of David, who always trusted in God, even when everything seemed lost. And so David's story shows us that even in the face of hatred and persecution, the choice to act with mercy and trust in God can transform not just one life, but an entire nation. David teaches us that the path of peace, kindness, and wisdom may be difficult, but it is always the one that leads us to true triumph. Did you like this story? What do you think of David's decision to spare Saul? Leave your comment below. Share your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Let's continue together on this journey of incredible learning.